Hello, Kentucky Realtor family, and I welcome you to our 7th Town Hall. Your leadership team and this presidential appointing group hopes that you and your family continue to be doing great in health and spirit. As you know, this group has been focused on giving you the best information that we can as we live and work in this and through this COVID-19 pandemic. Last week, the commission was asked to weigh in on open houses by several groups, including home builders, commissioners, realtors, and staff. So in response, the acting director, Jacob Walbourn, gave this information. He said, realtors can do open houses based on the fact that across the state, Kentuckians can now gather in groups no larger than 10 in accordance with the governor's orders and the CDC guidelines. Acting Director Walbourn then added, because you can doesn't mean that you should. He encouraged us to continue to use as much virtual work, including virtual open houses, as possible. He also encouraged realtors to first talk to your brokers and attorneys before doing open houses. After speaking with the team that was working on best practices for potential open houses, I spoke with the acting director to gain additional insight. KYR team quickly met on a pre-planned call that included KYR attorney Jason Vaughn, so that we could provide information for you, our realtor members. That brings us to where we are today, as we continue to try to give you the most important information that you need right now as we cross the bridge to the new normal. We have both Acting Director Jacob Walbourn and Jason Vaughn online. Acting Director Walbourn has been a terrific friend to the association, and as we transition from one administration to another, he's been personally involved with getting reciprocity completed with the state of Ohio, something that was sitting on the table of commission when he arrived. He is Deputy General Counsel for the Public Protection Cabinet and previously worked as a land use attorney, taking developers project from conception through completion, and also as Assistant Attorney General for the Commonwealth. Thank you, sir, for being with us today. And we also have Jason Vaughn, and for us, he doesn't need an introduction, recognized as a leading real estate attorney in Kentucky, representing lenders, brokers, developers, and title companies. He is a GLAR mediator and arbitrator and general counsel for us, the Kentucky Realtors. Thank you both for being with us. And with that, I turn it over to our moderator, NAR Director Lamont Breland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Director Walbourn and Jason Vaughn, for being here today. And thank you, Kentucky Realtors, for tuning in. I want to remind you that we do have our chat function open. So if you have any questions at all, please let us know those, and we will make sure the panelists can get to those. So Director Walbourn, I'll start with you. You know, I'm a active realtor out in the field, as most of our folks are, and like everybody else, we are taking the governor's orders, and those change night by night, right? So we have been deemed life essential, our industry, and we're so appreciative of that. But we are also cautious as we're out doing what we do, that we are observing the protocols and the wearing our masks and gloves and so forth. But of course, you're always going to have a bad actor or two. So that's the kind of the purpose of President Sanders' task force here, is to keep educating our members. So so I guess the next issue has been open houses. You know, we've kind of been preaching no open houses. We'll look at it in 30 to 45 days. But now as we're starting to reopen, here we are. So can you kind of bring us up to speed on where the Real Estate Commission is and what we need to be doing out in the field?
Certainly. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. As those of you who were on the commission's meeting earlier this month know, I turned into a pumpkin on Sunday night. Our new director starts Monday morning. And I'm sure you'll be very pleased with that leadership. But in the meantime, I'm more than happy to address that. On the KREC's webpage, and it was uploaded, I believe, finally yesterday morning, there is an updated memorandum. You all may be familiar with the fact that I had issued a memorandum at that time in my role as interim general counsel, basically synthesizing what the governor's orders at that point had done and what was and was not being allowed to be permitted. But as you noted, and I think is entirely accurate, the situation's evolving pretty rapidly. Frankly, I think that's good news because it means that the citizens of the Commonwealth are doing what we've needed to do to keep this virus under control. And so we're able to open back up. So to answer the point of open houses directly, based on the current orders that are in place from the governor's office, it is legally permissible to have an open house, provided that you comply with certain guidelines. Those guidelines are primarily two, and they are attached to that memorandum, so you don't have to go hunting for them. But if you're entering any of the guidelines that have been issued for any industry, those are available on the Healthy at Work website, which is healthyatwork.ky.gov. But as far as open houses are concerned, you have to comply with two sets of guidelines. One is what's called the minimum guidelines for all industries. And that is ensuring the health of you and your employees and the different hygiene measures and social distancing measures that need to be in place. The second set of guidelines is for gatherings of 10 or fewer people. Now, those are not going to read like they're specifically written towards open houses because they're not. They're written towards small group gatherings. But the governor, we did inquire with the governor's office and got a direct response that those are the guidelines that open houses would need to be conducted under. So if you can comply with the minimum guidelines, keep it to 10 or fewer people at a time, and also comply with the small group gathering guidelines, there is no legal prohibition against having open houses. Now, I would add on what I did before, and I'm a lawyer by training, so it's going to be hard for me not to give legal advice, but since I represent none of you, I'm going to resist strongly that urge. And that is, there are considerations that I think all of us have above and beyond what is legally permitted by the governor's orders. First and foremost is your own personal safety and the safety of your family. COVID is no joke, and I think that's becoming very clear, and it's particularly harmful to those at-risk populations, people with underlying health conditions or elderly people. And we need to be very cautious that we're not spreading the virus around. Does that mean you shouldn't have an open house? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying you need to take measures to protect yourself and your family members and those most vulnerable among us. I think there are means that you can undertake that are 100% safe. If you ask somebody to log onto a website, they're not going to be at risk to contract the coronavirus. But if you invite somebody into a home, that may put some risk there. So you have to make that value judgment and that safety judgment on your own. Now, where I won't opine on legal advice is there could also be some liability concerns about bringing people into a certain situation. And I won't tell you where I come out on that because I don't represent you. But I would strongly encourage you to make sure that your brokers understand what's going on, or if you're a broker, you understand what your agents are doing, and that also you understand what your legal risk could be and strategies to mitigate that risk. Now, that's an issue that's beyond the province of the Real Estate Commission, but I just throw it out there as a service. We don't want you to make a decision because you think it's legal that ends up getting you in a different kind of legal predicament. So that was a long and rambling answer to say, yes, open houses can resume.
But do it at your peril, it sounds like, especially as a broker. And that, I guess that's one thing that as I look at your Healthy at Work guidelines, and I know you're not going to give advice, and I think that's where, and Jason, feel free to chime in as needed. That's sort of where we are, I guess, struggling a little bit is, we want all agents, all brokers to have a competitive an equal competitive advantage, right? So we don't want to say you can't do it because you can, but then brokers may say, well, golly, here's my policy. I don't want you doing open houses. Others may say, I want you to do open houses, but you have to supply the PPE, at least minimum gloves and masks and sanitizer, maybe foot coverings. Others, as we know, they may require nothing. So there's going to be this kind of this strange dichotomy here in the coming, because I think this weekend will probably be the test, right? Because, last weekend was Memorial Day, and I think everybody was still not quite sure. So this Sunday, we might really, Monday morning, quarterback this thing. So is there anything, is that the way you may see it, that it may come down broker to broker and what their policies are? Because it sounds like that's where the liability would be, is A, not having a policy, and then B, how stringent is it? Any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, was that to me or to Mr. Vaughn?
Well, it was actually to you. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me, if I can interject for just a second, I'm not sure he's going to want to talk about liability to us, Lamont.
Okay.
I think he's going to put that lawyer hat back on and say, not my client. And correct me if I'm wrong, Acting Director Walbourn.
No, I think you got it cold.
Okay. If I can maybe interject for just a moment, one of the things that and to kind of address the issue that you raised, Lamont, is about a week ago when this was first starting to come about, I was approached by President Sanders and CEO Stevens and asked to put together kind of a conglomeration, so to speak, of what we were getting signal-wise from the governor, what we were getting signal-wise from Acting Director Walbourn, and also, what we were getting from the NAR. So what we did is go ahead and do that. We also reached out to several local brokers and also officers of the NAR or the KYR to try to put together some guidelines as we understood them. And fortunately, when Acting Director Walbourn spoke, I was like waiting to hear if I messed up. I think we're okay. I think we followed your plan. And let me kind of address a couple of those because I'm going to expand on a little bit of what he said. As I took it, their open houses are permitted with groups of up to 10 people, provided, number one, that these open houses comply with both the minimum requirements and the guidance for gatherings of up to 10 people.
That's correct.
In addition, all parties need to agree that they are amenable to having an open house. Now, this is important because when I say all parties, I don't just mean the seller. I mean the seller needs to understand what they're doing. The buyers that are coming in need to understand what they're doing. The realtors that are involved and real estate agents that are involved need to understand, as do any staff or assistants that are working with them. So let's talk for a second about what are the minimum requirements. The first is you've got to require social distancing 6 feet or more. Really can't emphasize that enough. And I know that that's hard in a sales type business to do that because we approach people, we talk to them, we do those things. But we can't be doing that in these situations. Also, we need to enforce universal masking. If somebody comes up to the property and they don't have a mask on, they really shouldn't be coming in. And you may want to plan ahead for that as an agent or broker. You may want to have disposable masks available so that you don't potentially lose a sale. But you shouldn't be letting them in if they don't have masking. You need to provide adequate hand sanitizer and encourage hand washing. If you have an access point to the property and it differs from the exit point, you probably should put hand sanitizer in both locations. You want them when they're coming in and you want them when they're going out. You also want to ensure proper sanitation. And there's lots of sites that'll tell you how to wipe things down, how to build bleach, wipes, what have you, but you need to make sure you do that. You need to make sure you limit face-to-face interactions. A lot of times we like to go in and complete the sale or what have you. You should really avoid that. And I'm going to talk about that a little more too later. With regard to your realtors and staff that are at the property, you need to conduct daily temperature and health checks with them, depending upon how often you have the open house. But also you need to make sure they're not sick. And if anybody that's on your staff that's going to be there does feel ill, you need to send them home. They don't need to be working through that illness. And finally, because there are things that you are going to touch and your staff are going to touch at an open house that others may be touching on a regular basis, you need to provide access to gloves to both your realtors and staff. Now, the second part of this is what does all parties agree requirement actually mean? That means that they understand the risks that are involved in going into a situation like this. We've kind of put together an addendum that relates to this, the COVID-19 property viewing addendum. The KYR has already created it. What I would suggest is have it posted at several points, both access points and at points throughout the property. Don't hand it out. That's not really what we want to do. We don't want to be touching things that other people are touching, but we want to make these things viewable and easily readable by any visitors. So you use the COVID addendum, property viewing addendum when possible. If you can put it on your MLS listing in case realtors are coming, it's there and it's already signed by your sellers. And then I would post a waiver agreement that says by entering this property, you agree to the COVID-19 addendum that is on display and you understand the risks that are involved. And me personally, as a way to avoid liability, I would take pictures of where you posted it. I would take so that it shows that anybody coming in the property would have had to walk right by this, would have had to acknowledge that it's there. And then by implication, by entering the property, they're accepting that. Will that hold up in court later on? I can't guarantee that, but I can tell you that that's better than not having anything there. And we also want to make sure the general public is informed as much as possible. Now, there is some additional guidance, if I can have a little leeway, Lamont, to go through that from the NAR.
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's talk about the three areas of guidelines the NAR has given. They deal with number one, what you do before you go to an in-person showing, including an open house, what you do during an in-person showing, and then what you do after an in-person showing. The NAR suggests that buyer's agents should encourage buyers to narrow their property search through photos, virtual tours, and leveraging other technology to reduce the number of in-person showings, but in this situation to also reduce the time. So if you have an opportunity to take your buyer kind of through the virtual tour first, and we all know that's not as good as a real in-person tour, but take them through that first so they have a general feel of the property, then you can move them through the property a little quicker. And then also afterwards, you could use it again. If you move them through pretty fast and you wish you could spend longer, say, let's go back and do the virtual and let's talk about it then, because that's going to be safer for us and it's going to get us out of the way of anyone else that may want to view the property. Listing agents, discuss with sellers the precautions that will be taken when showing their property and adhere to any specific requirements requested by the sellers showing the property. Make sure you talk to them about this. Don't blow by it. Don't overly encourage it. Don't oversell it. There's risk. And to what Acting Director Walbourn said, you know, he's not going to give us advice on liability, but just his concern about it should signal to you there is potential liability. And if a seller ends up getting sick and they go, my agent didn't say a word to me about anything, there's going to be problems. The last one in that section is for all agents. Request both the seller and potential buyers to self-disclose to you whether or not they have had any symptoms. If they have, just tell them this probably isn't the time to go view the property then. It's a sensitive subject, but it's one you need to talk to them about. But remember, even without symptoms, there are people that can transmit the disease that never show a single sign of COVID-19 symptoms. So they need to be aware of that. During in-person showings, don't shake hands. That seems obvious, but I still see people doing it in general public. Buyer's agents, discuss limiting the number of persons who may attend a showing. Where normally you may take a whole family and all the children, you know, this might be the time to say, let's limit it. Let's take mom and dad and let's do the tour with the kids, the virtual tour later with the kids, or if we like it, come back for a private showing that allows us to bring more people. All agents, instruct your buyers and others touring the home to avoid touching the surfaces of any area, such as light switches, cabinets, door handles. I would really encourage you, if you're opening the property up to people, make sure all the closet doors are already ajar. If you have to give instructions to people moving the house, say, I've left everything open, please don't close it. That makes sure that people don't have to touch more surfaces than necessary. Also, agents, instruct buyers and guests not to use bathrooms, facilities at the property. This is a little bit of a sensitive subject, But I think it's fair to say that the times have changed, and if they should plan ahead. If they think there's a possibility nature might call, they should plan ahead before they visit this property. Also, agents, do not share phones, pens, or tablets or other personal property during the showing. We can't be using the sign-in sheets like we used to. We can't be using the same pens like we used to. We need to figure out ways to do around that. It may be that you have a staff person with you that logs in their information orally, and you never get them to touch anything. I mean, in a perfect world, that may be the way to handle this. The last part is what you do after the showing. Listing agents, this is vitally important. Wipe down any surfaces that you believe have been touched during the showing with sanitizing wipes or disinfecting cleaner. Also, make sure you follow the seller's request regarding cleaning. And finally, emphasize to the seller that they should also do it themselves. Also, all agents speak with buyers outside the property or in ventilated areas. If your buyer seems really interested, go outside. Don't talk to them about it inside the property. Also, recognize that you're needing to use a 6-foot distance at the property. It's kind of hard to stand 6 feet apart and have a private conversation that the seller or somebody related to the seller might not hear. So it might be best to say, let's hold our conversation for a later time and let's talk about it then. Also, do not provide any paper documents. Do not provide any pictures. If you're the listing agent or the buying agent, leave any cards. You should all do this as much as possible digitally or orally. And finally, when you get back in your vehicle, because as has been mentioned before, your safety is as important and paramount as everyone else. Use hand sanitizer upon returning to your vehicle. Those are the guidelines we've kind of put together. I'm anxious to hear what some of our own members might have come up with as guidelines. But those are what has come to us from the NAR and with guidance from Director Walbourn. And we do appreciate all his efforts on this point.
So, gentlemen, talk for a minute about, I seem to see the words require versus strongly encourage and that type of thing. I mean, if you require something, it seems that then you have to enforce it. What is the difference, and is there liability with taking a strongly encourage versus require? You go to the grocery stores and it is strongly encouraged, but it is not a requirement. It does not appear through the large change. There are still people in those locations without masks, and they're not asked to leave.
Well, so from the Real Estate Commission's perspective, I would say that the Real Estate Commission in and of itself does not enforce the Healthy at Work guidelines. That is a function of the Department for Public Health, and it's primarily administered through the Cabinet for Health and Family Services and law enforcement. So as far as the KREC is concerned, we want you to have complete information to be in compliance with all laws, not necessarily the real estate specific statutes. But the blunt answer, at least as far as the government is concerned, as an employee and officer in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, I would tell you that if it is a requirement, there is potential penalties that could accrue. If it's strongly encouraged, that is not necessarily a basis for liability, or excuse me, not for liability, for criminal sanction or some kind of penalty from the government. And that's the reason why you don't see a government agent standing at the door at Kroger making sure somebody's wearing a mask, because in that scenario, it's only an encouragement. But if it's a requirement, there is the possibility of a government enforcement action. It would not come through KREC.
You know, I guess my concern is, folks are getting hangry right now. They're getting tempers are flaring, and we're seeing it more and more. If someone tries to enter an open house, they don't have a mask. If the agent says, no, you cannot come in this house, I mean, I could see where it could go south with some people. And that would be my concern, is if you say it is required, how are you going to enforce that? Not you. How is an agent on the street going to enforce that?
Well, Lamont, and to kind of add on to what Director Walbourn said, there's three things you're talking about there. You're talking about requirements, you're talking about direct recommendations, and then you're talking about seller directions. So let's talk about these. If you have a requirement, essentially that's a state law. Everybody has to follow that, okay? And there are, as Director Walbourn said, there are enforcement provisions and enforcement methods that are out there. So let's put aside the requirements for a second. Let's talk about recommendations. What Director Walbourn didn't talk about, because again, he wants to avoid this, is that with recommendations comes what we call a standard of the industry. So if you violate a recommendation, you may be violating a standard of the industry, which means you are acting out of the norm. And if you are acting out of the norm, then you are potentially increasing your liability for damages that occur for your actions. So for example, if an open house is allowed, and open houses have certain things that you're supposed to follow, and then there are recommendations that go along with that aren't laws, but everybody's kind of accepting, and you do something different, if somebody gets sick as a result of that, they're going to say you acted outside of the norm, and that's going to increase your potential liability. But the last point you say is really a better one, and this is something that we should do as a practical matter. If our seller says, for example, don't use or show my child who has asthma's restroom, okay? Don't even open it. Then that is a special instruction from a seller. You should update your listing agreement with that special instruction, and then you should follow that as if it's law, because the seller has told you, and the seller has an absolute right, short of issues related to a protected class, has an absolute right to tell people what they can and cannot do on their property. There is an implied license in an open house, but it's not absolute. So if that seller says, don't want anyone going in that restroom, and somebody tries to go in that restroom, you're their agent, you have the absolute right to say, don't go in there. And whatever you have to do to make them stop doing that, short of physical confrontation, you're entitled to do, because that's still the seller's property. So anytime the seller has something they really want you to do, get it in writing, sign it, make it an addition or an addendum to your listing agreement, and use those as special directions. And then if somebody says something to you as an agent or a broker at the property, say, I'm sorry, that's not me, that's not the governor, that's not the state, that's the seller. And this is her property or her property, and we need to respect their rights. I think that's absolutely fair. I can't hear Lamont.
Let's talk for a minute about this healthy at work guidelines. As you read through those, sometimes it says something like must, other times it says should, and I'm focusing in here on the requirements, for the health screenings. At what point should either a broker or B, an agent feel required to take a temperature of a client or an agent before they go in a house?
So as far as what I'll call there are really three sets of guidelines that I think are applicable to general real estate practice. The minimum requirements we've touched on, the gatherings of 10 people that we've touched on, but one that we necessarily haven't talked about in depth because this topic has been open houses is office operations. You all also typically have offices and want to work there and have employees that work there. The guidelines as far as minimum requirements go and office operations go are really angled at employees and not necessarily members of the public. I don't think that there's necessarily an expectation that you will be standing at the door of every open house you hold with a temperature gauge, measuring the temperature of everyone who goes in. That may or may not be advisable for any number of reasons, but I don't think that's the requirement that is in place through these healthy at work guidelines. So I would say that most of the guidelines really go more towards people that are in your employment orbit, people that work for you, your assistants, if you're a broker, your agents. You don't want to let an employee that works for you come in and expose your office or an open house to illness. We understand that you don't have a level of control over someone who might come in to visit an open house. You should still strongly encourage them not to come in if they're sick. You should strongly encourage them to wear a mask. But I think that's where you'll see the difference in the guidelines. requirements tend to go to employees. Strong suggestions tend to go to people that are not within your control. Some stores nationally have required masks to go in. Kentucky doesn't have that as a requirement, but Kroger can. If you would feel safer by saying, look, we're not going to let anybody into this open house that isn't wearing a mask, that's something I strongly encourage. There's a lot of data out there to support that masks inhibit the transmission of COVID-19. It's not so much wearing it, but if you have it, you don't give it to somebody else. But I think the literal interpretation is that those requirements, when they say requirements, they tend to go to either you or someone you can control. And I don't think you can control the public at large when they come to an open house. I think you have a responsibility there to try to keep things as safe as possible for yourself and your family, but also for everybody else. But it's a little different than a legal obligation.
So the good news is it looks like we're going to save money on snacks at the open houses, right? So we don't have to, that is a no-no, right? There'll be no refreshments at an open house.
Yeah, that would be a very poor idea. I guess in theory, there are some ways that you could do it safely, but it seems to me that that would just not be a great idea.
Right. Let's talk about home builders. There's a lot of building going on around the state. And is there anything that home builders or agents that are representing? It's a little bit different. You know, they may have 3 or 4 models open throughout a community where they might not be able to police that. Any thoughts or insights on that area of our industry? Either one of you.
Well, I would start to say that I understand those are different circumstances, but similar rules are going to apply. And it may be that where it's open all week and you have kind of a drib and drab of people that come in, you're not necessarily drawing the crowd that you might for an open house. That's when sanitation is going to be even more important. We all should have bought stock in Lysol wipes when all of this started, because they are the mother's milk of keeping people safe. If someone walks through a model, when they're done, you should go behind them and wipe down every surface that they touch, because that's the way that you're going to be able to keep it safe. Frankly, that's something you should consider in an open house context, but I actually like Jason's advice more. If you leave the door open, there's nothing for them to touch. So do whatever you can. I really think there are 3 things that you really need to be ensuring as much as you can. 1 is reduce touch. 2 is reduce contamination. That is, anytime that somebody does touch something, you go behind it and clean it with an antibacterial solution. I hear the Lysol wipes work great. And then 3, reduce physical contact. And that's the shaking hands, the standing within 6 feet of each other. Those are kind of the 3 things that I would emphasize there. So again, there's no problem with leaving open a model home. I know that those are very important in getting new homes sold. Just make sure you're taking the steps that if I walk, I think the assumption you have to make is and I don't mean it as negatively as it's going to sound, but you need to assume that every person that's walking through has coronavirus, and that you're going behind them and making sure that the next person that walks through isn't exposed to that. That's really the goal as far as I see it.
And, you know, the only other thing I could say, just from a practical point of view, if I had my choice and I was walking up to 2 houses, 2 potential model homes, and one said, you need a mask to come into this model home, and one didn't, I'd feel comfortable going in the one that had the mask requirement, because I think, okay, they're careful. The other one, I might be like, it's not worth it. So what you may think makes people go away may actually be what makes them come in.
So we've talked a lot about what goes on in the house. I'm thinking about the listing that, that we see that's listed on Wednesday, no showings till Friday, or let's say listed on Friday, no showings till the open house on Sunday. Maybe it's priced just right. And there's pent up demand. So the agent gets there, and all of a sudden there's already 5 or 6 cars there. Is there anything, I guess I'm thinking cones or something, to keep people that are congregating outside. If you have 20 people show up, and this could happen, at 2 o'clock you have 20 people already there, and optics are important, it appears, in this world. Is there anything that we should be doing as agents to be prepared for a really good turnout, and not getting folks in the house, but while they're outside?
The only thing I thought about is bring painter's tape. Mark 6 foot spaces between people, where, hey, stand at this X, next person stand at this X. When you come in the house, don't go beyond that blue piece of painter's tape until we let you in, whatever it may be. It's $3 for a pretty lengthy length of masking painter's blue tape. And people look at it and people notice it. That would be the only thought I might have if you're concerned about a decent sized crowd, that you leave something that the crowd knows, hey, this is the thing that we should follow.
That's good. Now here's a good lawyer question. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say I was also going to tack on sidewalk chalk because it's pretty cheap too. And it's a good way if you've got 20 people and you can only, you and an assistant are in there, you can really only have 8 in at a time. Well, and I assume, just so everyone is on the same page, that doesn't apply. Social distancing doesn't apply to family groups. So if I show up with my wife, I don't have to stay 6 feet apart from her. She may like that, but it's not legally required. But you can basically set off a 6x6 square and say, all right, next in line, stand here, next in line, stand here. And that's a 50-cent solution. And then that you're in compliance. For the record, when these enforcement people are coming out, they're not coming out and seeing somebody who's 5.5 feet away and getting out the tape measure and saying, you were just off. The goal is to reduce transmission of the virus. So if you can use just some reasonable steps to show, hey, I'm trying to comply here. I've set off 6 foot areas for people to congregate. That's what we want. We want you to encourage people to do the right thing. It's probably no mystery to anybody on this call, but the Commonwealth of Kentucky, even if we were to mobilize every law enforcement officer we had, cannot go house to house and ensure everybody's doing what they're supposed to. It's asking our professionals to come up with ways to, here's how we're going to keep operating to keep people safe. We want that kind of positive social pressure for people to comply with these things. So make it easy for them to comply. Painter's tape to make sure they're not getting ahead of the game, wonderful idea. Lining them outside, making sure there's spaces 6 feet apart for people to wait. Again, low cost solutions. It shows that you take it seriously and it's going to keep you out of those enforcement concerns. That's my opinion. I can't swear it, but I strongly feel that's where it would come out.
I like that idea. Get the kids involved before the open house with the chalk. Now we're going to have first toilet paper. Now we'll have a run on chalk. So here's a good question for you. So you have the open house. You do everything by the book. Everybody leaves. You're a good realtor, so you go through and you wipe down everything with your Lysol wipes. You get home. You get a call 9 o'clock that night. 5 of the tables are faded. The finish is faded from the Lysol wipes. Is there liability there? That was a question on the side. Who wants to take that one?
Well, let me put it to you this way. There may be liability for furniture repair if you haven't talked to the seller about that beforehand. So what you should be doing is saying, I'm going to clean the place, but I'm going to use this product, which is bleach and this thing and what have you. Are you okay with that? If the seller says you're okay with that and then there's a problem, I mean, you could argue that there's liability, but I don't think there's much likelihood of you being found responsible. If you're in a home, let's say, that has very high-end or older materials, antiques and such, it's a decent conversation to have. I'm not making fun of the question because I know my grandmother has wonderful antiques, and she would die if she saw me pull out a wipe and start, going across it. But the thing is to have that conversation beforehand, to say, this is what we're going to do before, this is what we're going to do after, and are you okay with that? And if they say yes, then, there's not going to be liability.
That's good. I've got another question here. Per the KYR regulations, is it improper for an agent or broker to refuse to conduct an open house if a seller is requesting it?
Particularly given the present circumstances, I do not believe that would be a violation of KYR regulations. Look, we're in a different world right now, and I'm hesitant to opine on what is and is not violations because factual circumstances are going to vary wildly from case to case. But the bottom line, and I can tell you in my 48 hours of remaining tenure, but will remain true once I'm no longer the acting executive director, is that we will never hold it against a real estate professional that's doing something to keep them or their clients safe. Your obligations, you're more familiar with your obligations than I'll ever be, but the number one priority with all of this COVID related stuff is to stay safe. So no, the KREC would not pursue discipline. If you have legitimate concerns about hosting an open house, you sign listing agreements, and there are other legal considerations here that I'm not opining on. But as far as the KREC is concerned, no.
Jason,
Now,
I'm sure.
The only thing that I would put a caveat on that, and I think the directors said it, if your concerns are legitimate. My only caveat on that would be, if you tell one party, I don't do them, and then you end up doing it for two others, that's where you may run into a problem. Your legitimate concerns must run equally across your clientele, or there must be a reason why that particular one you said no, something about the property, something about, the location, what have you, meant you didn't feel safe doing it there. But if you're doing it for A and B, and then you say, I'm not going to do it for C for safety concerns, recognize there may be a question about the legitimacy of your refusal. But I think, I appreciate Director saying that, hey, if you're just saying I'm not safe, I don't feel safe for my client, my customer, me, I think that's a good point. But I do concern that you turn down some and accept others.
And I think that's a fair caveat, and I would readily accept that. If you can't pick and choose, either you're concerned about it, or there's some specific reason that you're concerned about it in this circumstance. If the client, for instance, says, well, I travel internationally all the time and I've had the sniffles, that may well be a reason that you wouldn't want to do an open house in that particular scenario. But for lack of a better way of putting it, it's got to be legitimate.
So Jason, and I guess it would depend on each listing agreement that is signed, and I'm not even sure in Louisville if it mentions anything about an open house. But where I'm going with this is, and I had this happen yesterday with one of my agents, where the seller is, saying there will be an open house, and my agent is not super comfortable with it. Could that be grounds for violating the terms of our listing contract, and where they could get out of the contract and list with someone else?
Well, let's kind of break that down a little bit. Let's first take an example of your company. You've got several agents that are working for you. As a broker, what I would recommend to the broker is to go look at that agent and say, I understand that you don't feel comfortable doing this, but our contract says we're going to do it, let's say. So what we need to do is I as a broker need to look about having somebody else do this, and not you. And we need to have a discussion about how we're going to handle that. And that may be one that you have to talk to your personal brokerage attorney about, because there may be issues of you're taking a potential commission from one agent and moving it to another. But if somebody's saying because of safety concerns or a concern like that, I don't want to do it, that doesn't automatically relieve you of your obligation as a broker to do something you have contractually agreed to do. And this raises a lot of questions. Is this such what you would call an act of God that it properly interferes with contractual relations? Maybe, but one of the things that you have to do is kind of mitigate things under the law. So if you have the ability to move another agent that's willing to do it, you as a broker need to consider that that's what you do. And now that open houses are open, so to speak, it's hard to say that the pandemic has stopped them. At the same time, we need to balance that with, let's say you have an older agent in their 70s that's had breathing issues in the past, and they're like, I just can't risk this. Completely understandable. I think everybody would understand, but then you have to figure out what you can do as a broker to do that. Now let's take a different situation where the broker is literally their only agent. They are a single person agent, broker, and they're in that same position of being older and having breathing issues. They may very well just say, I can't do this, and I'm not going to do it because it endangers my health. I think it would be very hard pressed for any court, arbitrator, and forgive me for speaking out of turn, but governmental authority to come in and say, we don't really care that you're worried about a pandemic that particularly targets someone like you. You should have had an open house. I don't see that happening. I don't see anybody saying that that's it. But you as a broker, if you can make accommodations to continue to perform your contractual duties, I think you should try to do so.
Good. So let's talk about tenants. So let's say I've got a single family investment property I'm selling, or a 10-plex. If the tenant refuses to allow entry into their unit or their home because of fears of COVID, what legal remedies are there? And let's say they do, another switch gears here, let's say they do get in and then the tenant gets sick. Is there some type of release form that a tenant can sign to that end?
Well, let's talk about this. Most of your leases, and I don't want to give legal advice, and the first thing you do when you're and this is really what we're talking about, I assume, is situations in which our realtor member is acting as a property manager.
Well, not necessarily. Let's say, because typically you show a 10-plex, maybe you get in 2 of the units. You know, and then if you like it, you write an offer, but it's contingent upon inspection of all the units. So it could be a property manager, or it could be, you know, just a realtor selling a property.
Okay. Well, in any of these situations, what you're going to be primarily or initially relying on is the lease agreement between the landlord and the tenant, which, if it's a proper agreement, will have language in there that talks about right of entry, right to view the property, right to do all of those things. All right. So let's remember this, that eviction courts are closed. So if you had a tenant that said, you're not coming in, I don't know how you'd get to enforce it. I mean, because you're not going to get in front of a court for the right to evict them. Good luck getting in front of a court for purposes of an injunction to try to get them. If you call a policeman or a sheriff, they're going to show up and say, this is a civil matter. You got to take care of this in court. So in short, it's a moot question, because if a tenant locks their doors and says, don't come in, there's not really a remedy for the landlord available anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's going to your buyers are going to have to recognize, we got to roll with the times. And even though I want to see all 10 properties, if I'm really interested, I may just have to move forward without it. And that's unfortunate, but you know, this is one of those things where everybody's worried about how to do it. There's no way to fight about it anyway. There's no court available to you to address this issue, at least in my opinion.
Good. Okay. Let's see what else we have. Okay, so one other question is, and we may have touched on it, but let's say a seller requires the agent to have all showings, all folks that come into the house have their temperature checked and wear a mask. Can that be added as special instructions in the listing agreement or in the MLS?
I don't see why not, but I'll defer to the director.
No, I think that would be perfectly acceptable.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, we are at 48 minutes into this. Any closing comments or thoughts that you'd like to add? And no is fine. But we have one more question.
Okay. Well, we'll do that.
All right. Do pre-closing and post-closing occupancy agreements have the same eviction policies in place? So while eviction courts are closed, if a buyer seller refuses to leave the property and doesn't fulfill the closing, that issue may not be resolved until eviction courts are open, ?
Yeah. So let me address that first. I do not believe in pre-closing possession. Do not do it. I can't say it enough. Because the buyer now has an equitable interest in the property in a pre-closing situation, if you also give them possession, there is a very strong argument that you can't even use the eviction court, that if they don't close, you've got to foreclose against them, which could be 6 months to 2 years, if not longer, especially in this environment, to try to get them out. Because if you take them to eviction court, they're going to stand up and say, I have this contract. It gives me an interest in the property. I don't belong here. And that court's probably going to say, yeah. They're going to send it to circuit court. Circuit court's going to send it to the master commissioner, and you're going to be fighting that forever. So you really shouldn't be doing pre-possession agreements or occupancy at all. Let's talk post-possession. Post-possession, it's absolutely right. It's a really good question. Yeah, there's not a different eviction court for you. So if you are allowing for post-possession and that person just says, hey, you know what, my next house I can't get into because of this issue, I don't have anywhere to go and I'm not moving, they're not moving.
Period. All right. All right. That was good. Well, gentlemen, now I'll say, if you have anything, last words for us, now's your chance.
Well, I'm a lawyer by trade, so I can't help myself but offer a few closing words. But in all seriousness, there is no one at KREC or in any portion of the government in the Commonwealth that doesn't understand the extreme situation that we're in and how it's impacted everybody's lives. And so first I want to say thank you because the realty community really has been excellent to work with on this. We're mindful of your frustrations. I'm frustrated too. I'm a guy who likes to travel. I'm a guy who loves college football. And just knowing that that may not be in the cards this year has been really hard for me to swallow. But we do better as a state when we all try to do the right thing. And so I'm extremely grateful for this community, to the Realtors Association, for trying to do the right thing. So I'm extremely grateful for that. And then this, I think, will be my last official appearance as the interim executive director. And so I want to say, one, unfortunately, this won't be the end of me. I will still be serving as Deputy General Counsel at the Public Protection Cabinet and will still be involved in some of these issues. So you'll probably see me again, but it's truly been an honor to serve you. I know we're not batting 1,000, but we've been trying to do a lot better. And we're very grateful to the leadership of KYR because they have been fantastic to work with. They represent you well with us. And so I'm extremely grateful to all of you, our licensees. You're the reason that we have a job, and we're mindful of that. And you should rest assured knowing that you're well represented in Frankfort because KYR does a fantastic job taking care of you. So good luck, and I'll see you around. But it's been an honor to be here, and please stay safe out there.
Well, and Director, thank you for your service. You came in at a tough time and left the place a lot better than you found it, I would say. And thank you for all you've done.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank
enjoy
you.
your retirement. And Jason, how about you, sir?
The only thing that I will say is I had a fairly lengthy description of things to remember when you're showing properties, both with what we said that the state requires and that the NAR recommends. Fortunately, if you didn't take quick notes, we've also done a video on that. Paul Del Rio with the KYRs helped me put it together. That should be available in the next few days, and that will go through much of the same information again, and you can also share that with your agents. I know Steve Stevens wanted to put that together, as did Lester Sanders. So hopefully that'll be available here real soon. And thanks for letting us talk.
Great. And Paul Del Rio has done a great job. His fingers are probably getting ready to fall off. He has been chronicling all this on chat somehow. And all that will be up on our KYR Realtor /COVID page. Again, make sure you keep going to that for updates. And gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it back to our president, Lester Sanders.
Since you've turned it back over to me, I better unmute my mic. It's clear to us that the battle for COVID-19 is not done. It's certainly not done for realtors. The important thing I think that this tells us is that we can't get lax. We've got to continue to monitor ourselves first as we move forward. And again, Director Walbourn, we certainly appreciate the opportunity that we've had to work with you, and we look forward to working with you in a positive sense after you go back to the other position that you actually hold at the same time. And with Jason, it's always great to have you. Our members appreciate when you share knowledge like you did today. And it's just important. It's crucial for us to be able to give the information. And in the end, I think we have to say, when we leave here, talk to your brokers. Make sure you understand what they want you to do and how you want us to do it. And everybody wants you to have the opportunity to sell, but make sure you're safe first. Lamont, again, thanks for your moderating today. Steve, thank you. You're here with us as well. And so with that, I'll shut it down for today. And everybody have a terrific day and great weekend starting tomorrow.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you, Director.